Uh, Hello, I am Cliff Smith, the Washington Project Director of the Middle East Forum, and today for our webinar, we have a very special guest in Congressman Jim Banks. Middle East Forum has been friends with Congressman Banks since his first term in Congress. Briefly, he represents Indiana's 3rd Congressional District since 2017. He is the chairman of the Republican Study Committee this Congress, the largest caucus in Congress. He serves on the House Committee on Armed Services, Veterans Affairs, and Education and Labor. Previously, he served 6 years in the Indiana State Senate. He is a member of the Naval Reserve and has deployed to Afghanistan. He holds a BA from Indiana University and an MBA from Grace College. Welcome, Congressman Banks.
Hey, great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Look, there are many topics we could discuss about what goes on in Washington and how it relates to policy towards the Middle East, Israel, radical Islam, and other topics that are of interest to the Middle East Forum. And I'm sure we could spend hours talking about any one of them, but I'll just pull out a few today. Let's start by talking about some recent past, and that is the Abraham Accords. You personally attended the signing of the Abraham Accords, which were agreements facilitated by the Trump administration between Israel, Bahrain, and UAE for diplomatic relations, economic relations, and so on. And later on, they were joined by Morocco and Sudan. Hopefully, this leads to a new and better future for Israel and its Arab neighbors. My question to you is, what lesson do you think we should be learning from these events, and what is next in Israel's relationship with its neighbors?
Well, Cliff, to begin with, President Trump and the Trump administration deserves enormous credit for negotiating these historic agreements in the Abraham Accords. As you said, I was there. One of the highlights over the 4 years of the Trump administration to be there on hand as the agreements were signed by President Trump and his counterparts. And what's as historic and what's as important as to know as the work that went into negotiating those agreements. By the way, everyone said it couldn't be done. There were headlines for years, not just attacking the Trump administration for seeking to negotiate these deals, but mocking the Trump administration. There's no way that Donald Trump can negotiate deals like these, and he ended up doing it, and he never got enough credit for it. But I want to compare how important and significant this agreement was with an article on December 9th of 2020 in the Washington Post. And in that article, this was before President Biden was sworn into office, but President Biden's advisors said that offering a peace plan between Israel and the Palestinians is not a strategic priority. And that should be duly noted today, because at this point today, not only is it not a priority for President Biden to further the important work of the Trump administration, to put an emphasis on this, President Biden still has not yet today even nominated anyone to serve in the important post as ambassador to Israel, which tells you that the Biden administration is not at all concerned with the nature of the instability in the Middle East or issues at large related to the long-term stability or the partnerships with our most important ally of all allies, that being Israel. If he's not interested in that relationship or the stability of the Middle East, and we have to ask ourselves, what is he interested in?
Yeah. That actually leads me to the next question I had, and that is, it's related, and that is, you talk about the Biden administration sort of not looking at Israel and the Israel-Palestine conflict. Last Congress, you endorsed a concept the Middle East Forum has endorsed, basically the concept that Israel needs to achieve victory over the Palestinians. That doesn't mean anything specific. It means the idea that Israel will one day end and just go away, that needs to be taken off the table. How do you think that the further recognition of Israel will, or perhaps should, affect the Israel-Palestine conflict? And do you think that these recognitions of Israel will help it achieve victory over this idea that its existence will one day end?
Well, it's such an important question, because you have to, at the outset, as you ask it, you have to understand the paradigm. The Palestinians want to eliminate Israel. They want to defeat Israel, and they meet it in a militaristic way, in militaristic terms, and they want to wipe Israel off the planet, literally. So by endorsing efforts for Israel to remain victorious, we're not talking about militaristic terms. We're talking about for Israel to prevail and for it to continue to be a powerful, independent state, and that's why the Trump administration's efforts on this path and negotiate the Abraham Accords and a lot of the other important work that the Trump administration did for 4 years, it made President Trump the most pro-Israel president that we had ever had, and that put an exclamation mark after that, underline it. No one comes close in being a pro-Israel advocate as president of the United States. No one comes close to the important work that President Trump and his administration did over 4 years. So why do the Abraham Accords matter? They mattered because of the recognition, because of the Arab countries who joined in this historic agreement with Israel, recognizing Israel's borders and putting pressure on Palestine to recognize Israel's sovereignty and their right to live peacefully. That's why it mattered, and that's why it was historic. That's why it was important. I mean, it had been a generation since another American president had led peace talks like President Trump did between the Arab countries who are represented in Israel. And again, President Trump deserves so much credit for it. He never got it from the mainstream media. He didn't get it publicly. It was covered up. But these were historic agreements that mattered greatly to the sovereignty of Israel. And I hope that history will look back. I know history will look back at these agreements and President Trump's leadership in a way in the decades or generations to come. They will look back very favorably at the work that President Trump did when it came to these peace accords.
So that on that topic, obviously you would have supported a lot more President Trump's approach to the Middle East much more than Biden's. And so now that President Biden is now the president, a question I have for you is, particularly as the head of the Republican Study Committee, as I mentioned, one of the largest caucuses in Congress, you're in a position to both support the Biden administration if you think it's right, and to propose an alternative as the opposition party. And so is there any area where you think it's especially important to sort of oppose the Biden administration, and are there any areas where potentially there might be some agreement in ways that can be worked together?
Well, I mean, Cliff, from the outset, I mean, we're 3 months into the Biden administration, and the only foreign policy that we've seen from Joe Biden so far is a reversal back to the Obama era policies and the Obama foreign policies, which shouldn't surprise us since Obama filled his cabinet with Obama. This is Obama's third term when you look at the makeup of the Biden administration. Biden's foreign policy advisors are Obama's foreign policy team. So it shouldn't surprise us that now the posture of the Biden administration is one of appeasement. It's one of leading from behind. It is the opposite of the foreign policy that we saw from during the Trump era, which I would compare Trump's foreign policy to Reagan's peace through strength. The Reagan era foreign policy, there's nothing that comes closer between Reagan and Trump when it comes to their foreign policy. One of strength, one of leadership on the global stage, a realist foreign policy that puts American interest first and ahead of all else, and recognizing in that Israel is our most powerful ally, most important ally globally. So the juxtaposition between the Trump foreign policy and the Biden foreign policy couldn't be any more stark. All of that being said, I mean, in these first 3 months, it appears that President Biden is hell bent upon re-entering the disastrous Iran nuclear deal, and the Biden foreign policy so far can be summed up with his path forward on a complete withdrawal from Afghanistan, and doing it on the anniversary of that tragic day on 9/11 20 years later. There couldn't be any worse symbolism, by the way, than completely withdrawing from Afghanistan and allowing the Taliban to declare victory on the day that they precipitated one of the greatest attacks on American soil in American history. So that is the Biden foreign policy. And in that, it makes it very easy for us as Republicans, as chairman of the Republican Study Committee, as you said, the largest conservative caucus on Capitol Hill, there are 154 of us. It makes it very easy for us to show a very stark difference between those administrations and why we oppose the Biden Obama era foreign policy of weakness and appeasement.
So you mentioned Afghanistan. You're a veteran of Afghanistan. And so do you agree with the decision to remove troops or disagree with it just on the way he's doing it? Or do you disagree with it in general? Do you think that, how do you think that the US's policy towards Afghanistan should be in the future?
Well, I hope the future is different than the past. I mean, for 20 years, we've been doing the same thing over and over again. And as General H.R. McMaster would say, we do it over and over again on an annual basis. So it's like fighting what will be a 20-year war and fighting it 20 times, year by year, doing the same thing over and over again. I don't have to tell you what the definition of insanity is, but it meets the definition because we learn the same mistakes over and over again. We don't do anything about it. It's my sense, though, after being on Capitol Hill for 4.5 years, serving on the Armed Services Committee, serving in Afghanistan in uniform and going back and traveling to Afghanistan as a member of Congress, that it should be all of our goal, members of Congress, the president. I know it's President Trump's goal. I'm not sure what this will look like on President Biden's watch, but it should be our goal to bring our troops home, but to do so in a responsible way where we leave a stable and strong Afghanistan behind. And by leaving today, we know, because America's top military minds have told us, that it will be only a matter of days or weeks before the Taliban completely take over Afghanistan once we completely withdraw. And that's why many of us believe and advocated to both President Trump and to President Biden in an Afghanistan policy of leaving a light footprint with a counterterrorism focus and get out of the failed nation building attempts that we've made over the last 20 years that have been a colossal failure on all parts, and instead focus on doing what we went into Afghanistan to do to begin with, which is to defeat a significant enemy and threat to the United States of America in radical Islamic terrorism, which we see in many forms, from the Taliban to the rise of ISIS-K in Afghanistan is something that does not get enough attention. I know that you guys have paid a lot of attention to this, but the rise of a much more dangerous ideology of ISIS-K building up in Afghanistan. By us leaving, we're ceding Afghanistan to these terrorist groups who will build Afghanistan back into what it was before September 11th, 2001, which was a safe harbor for terrorists in this region, in this country. We can't afford to do that, or we will be right back where we started. We learn the mistakes of the Obama era when the abrupt withdrawal in Iraq led to the rise of ISIS. President Trump campaigned, by the way, on defeating ISIS, and he did it. He broke up the caliphate in Iraq and Syria, but now we have a growth of ISIS and the branch of ISIS-K growing in Afghanistan. We can't afford to turn this back over to them again, and we know where this will lead in the aftermath. So and all of that to say, I mean, I don't want to ramble any longer, Cliff, but again, as someone who served in Afghanistan, who served with troops who died and paid the ultimate sacrifice in Afghanistan, served with those who did. Let me tell you, there's nothing more offensive than the thought of, on September 11th, the Taliban declaring victory 20 years to the day of that tragic event that happened in New York City when I was a college student watching on television. What inspired me to serve my country in a big way afterward, there couldn't be any worse imagery, any worse symbolism than what will occur if Joe Biden allows that to happen.
Yeah, definitely know where you're coming from on that one. On the issue of Iran, you already mentioned it. We already know that the Biden administration is having backdoor talks with Iran. You've called this a scandal in the past, and you strongly opposed his efforts to re-enter the Iran deal, which the Biden administration is quite openly trying to re-enter. I know, I believe just yesterday, you introduced the Maximum Pressure Act, along with, I believe it was 83 of your colleagues on the Republican Study Committee. And this is basically what you view as what should be the Republican approach to Iran vis-a-vis the Biden approach to Iran, which is very different. Can you tell me more about this legislation and what you hope it can accomplish?
Yes, I mean, I like you, I'm deeply troubled by the signals of the Biden administration about re-entering the Iran nuclear deal, appeasing Iran, when all the while we know that appeasement abets a weakness and shows weakness on our part that allows for Iran to rebuild their nuclear program, to continue to fund their proxy groups who have done harm and cost the lives of thousands of American troops in different places. It's why we took out Soleimani, the biggest terrorist on the world stage under President Trump's leadership. Why in the world would we agree to re-enter a deal that we know was a failed deal to begin with? That even after Obama entered into the Iran nuclear deal, Iran continued to build their nuclear program. It wasn't a successful deal in any way to begin with, and President Trump was right to get us out of it. In fact, he campaigned on it, and it was one of many promises that he made on the campaign trail that he kept. The maximum pressure campaign on Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo, Secretary Mike Pompeo's watch, was a successful campaign. And we know that the maximum pressure campaign worked because it dried up resources in Iran. It dried up their economy. It dried up their resources to funnel to their proxy groups. And now the Biden administration wants to reverse it. And because they're attempting to re-enter the deal and reverse the maximum pressure campaign, the Republican Study Committee, which I chair, wrote the Maximum Pressure Act. We introduced it yesterday. We have nearly 90 co-sponsors, if not over 90 co-sponsors at the moment. I expect many more to sign on to it as it gets more attention in the days to come. And it was great, Cliff, by the way, to have Secretary Pompeo join us out in the triangle in front of the Capitol yesterday as we unveiled this major piece of legislation, because we wanted to send a signal to the Ayatollah and to Joe Biden that if you re-enter the Iran nuclear deal and reverse all of the sanctions on Iran, it's not going to last for long, because Republicans are going to win the majority in the midterms in 2022, and we're going to put those sanctions back in place right away once we take back control and force the hand of the Biden administration. There's also another component of this I want to talk about for a moment, and that's the proper role of the legislative branch of government, the Congress. The Obama administration circumvented Congress by not passing this as a treaty through the Senate when he signed on to the Iran nuclear deal. It's shameful, and it appears that the Biden administration is going to take the same path forward. And the Maximum Pressure Act that I introduced with almost 90 of my colleagues is Congress reasserting its proper role in this equation is something that you can count on a Republican Study Committee and conservatives like me to continue to do in the future.
So, in terms of the long term, you think that how do you think this legislation will affect the long-term strategy in Iran, regardless of who's president? I mean, whoever is president, you're saying that Congress ought to play a bigger role in the foreign policy towards Iran and making sure that we have a consistent policy is kind of what I'm hearing you say.
Yes, if the president and his administration are going to circumvent Congress, and we have a constitutional responsibility to fill the void, to do what we're supposed to do to begin with, and assert our role ourselves, especially if the president is trying to take it away from us. But as far as the long-term goal, if President Biden is going to re-enter this disastrous deal and appease and reward Iran for their bad behavior, then Congress needs to step up to the plate and do something about it. But let's take a step back and remember that President Trump issued 1,500 sanction designations on Iran and 5 executive orders expanding those sanctions. And as a result of those sanctions, we know that Iran's foreign currency reserves dropped 95%. That's why I said a little bit ago that the maximum pressure campaign worked. The Iranian military budget dropped by 25% because we dried up their resources, and their proxy groups and their militias had to cut their fighters' salaries in half as a result. So with the maximum pressure campaign that we introduced yesterday, 90 co-sponsors and growing, a product of our work with the Republican Study Committee, we codify the maximum pressure campaign that Mike, really in the spirit of Mike Pompeo's work as Secretary of State, that he wrote. We codify that into law to determine the foreign policy moving forward. We should never reward Iran for their bad behavior. By doing so, we show weakness and we invite more of their malign activities to occur in the future. And when we're talking about foreign policy at large, it's the opposite of what America's foreign policy should look like, especially in the Middle East.
In terms of rewarding or not rewarding bad acts, another big issue in American foreign policy in general is our relationship with China, which is increasingly antagonistic. You have been very vocal in calling out China's bad acts. One thing that has not gotten nearly as much attention as I think it deserves is the fact that China is increasingly diplomatically and economically involved in the Middle East. Initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative are going right into the Middle Eastern countries. They are been increasingly economically entwined with Turkey, with Iran. They're looking to play a reconstruction role in Syria. This is not even close to exhaustive. Bottom line is China is now seeking very strongly to be a player in the Middle East. Basically, how big of a problem do you think China's involvement is? What should our US policy towards China's involvement in the Middle East be? And there are ways we could roll back China's influence that they've already gained.
Well, we're not off to a good start in this administration to do that, and that should be troublesome to every American. By the way, if you have a chance, Cliff, I know you're an avid reader, but the new book by Josh Rogan, Chaos Under Heaven, lays out a case that I think is made better than anywhere else that I've read it. I don't know if you've picked it up yet, but it's worth reading. And really, it calls out where in many ways, the conflict within the Trump administration. How President Trump addressed the China threat in a unique way, but also where the Trump administration fell short. And I think it's important to go back and I have take a look at the missed opportunities over the last 4 years so we can learn from them. But on President Biden's watch, I mean, we're seeing a new president take office, and in his earliest days has very little. Shows very few signs of actually holding the Chinese Communist Party accountable and reasserting America's role to circumvent the debt trap diplomacy that you describe that China is employing in the Middle East. Why does it matter to us? It matters to us because for China to diplomatically assert themselves in areas where the United States has historically enjoyed strong relationships with countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, Egypt, other countries those are, by the way, those are 4 of the 5 countries that President Trump's ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, warned that China was building up in the Middle East more than elsewhere, at Israel and Iran. So Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Israel, and Iran. I mean, and a few of those countries are very important partners. And if a couple of them are obviously not, but what China's debt trap diplomacy puts them in a position and a situation where they can leverage those investments and these new relationships that they're building to use that leverage against the United States of America. I mean, that is the Chinese Communist Party's end goal, is to dominate the United States of America. They know that if they can entangle themselves in places where the United States has historically enjoyed strong relationships, like with Israel, China knows that that's one way to accelerate their dominance over the United States economically and militarily in the long term. So that's deeply troubling to me. And what's even more troubling is that the Biden administration so far has turned a complete blind eye to any efforts that were started under President Trump, or because they were started under President Trump, President Biden has no interest in continuing efforts that would hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable and to reassert our leadership in places where it's desperately needed. So that's something that I work on extensively in my work here on Capitol Hill and on the Armed Services Committee, and something that I appreciate the work that you all do and look forward to partnering more with you on in the future.
Yeah. We're running out of time, but I'll ask you one last question. While we're in China's neighborhood, you are chair of the Pakistan caucus, one of China's neighbors. You've been active regarding questions in South Asia. You've also been active in calling out radical elements in the region, such as Jamaat-e-Islami, a large network that the Middle East Forum's done a lot of work on. Last Congress, you introduced a resolution calling out Jamaat-e-Islami's bad acts and their potential involvement in terror finance. But that is a continuing issue of, as you mentioned, China's influence in Pakistan, which is their neighbor, is another real issue. And the wider issue, you see all kinds of different conflicts that inevitably come back to the United States' alliance and interests. In the South Asia, China region, and that also, by the way, goes back to the Middle East. Radical ideologies in particular don't know borders. So what should the US policy be towards these sort of sub-state networks of radicalization? And what should our policy be towards South Asia and how it balances back to the Middle East?
Yeah, again, another very important question. I participate as a member of the Afghanistan caucus, the Pakistan caucus, the India caucus. I've taken a significant role in all of these caucuses because I believe that to bring stability to that region, we have to figure out what our strategy is moving forward. And I'm often critical of the Biden administration, but these were areas as well where too often during the Trump era and the Trump administration, there was an erratic strategy that often changed too quickly to keep up, or didn't make sense, and creating a way forward to address some of these issues over the last 4 years as well. So that being said, the Mike Pompeo-led State Department made strong gains on tackling some of these developing strategies to combat some of these terrorist groups and other elements. So far, in the first 3 months of the Biden administration, I've seen little effort or interest in the Middle East at all, but especially on addressing some of these threats that are important, not just to the United States, but to our allies like Israel. And that's unfortunate too. I mean, again, at the outset of our conversation, Cliff, how is it that President Biden still has not nominated an ambassador to Israel, our most important ally, and at least in the Middle East, if not altogether the most important ally that we have around the world, whose interests are most closely aligned with the interests of the United States of America? How is it that he hasn't even nominated an ambassador yet to serve in that important post? It's because there's so little attention or desire to address these issues on behalf of this new administration. That should be deeply troubling to all of us. That and the rising threat and violence that we're seeing from ISIS, Al Qaeda, Taliban, other terrorist groups in this region is something that the Biden administration, apparently they just hope it will go away. It's not going to go away if we don't have a strategy to combat it. And as a member of Congress, it's my job to push the administration to do that.
All right, Congressman, thank you very much. I would ask more, but I think we're out of time. Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope we talk to you again soon.
Thank you. Great to be with you.